pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Zachary Gorman. Zachary is a graduate of Sydney University, of Wollongong University, and worked in the Institute of Public Affairs and is now the historian at the Robert Menzies Institute. And I first ran across Zachary when I reviewed a book on young Menzies, which was in the Australian Book Review, and that's the first of a series that Zachary will talk about this morning. So again, welcome Dr. Zachary Gorman.
Yeah, thanks David. So, as David alluded to, we've got this project that we're doing at the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne, where we've got this series of 4 annual conferences looking at different periods of Menzies' life in the Menzies era, and then the papers presented at those conferences get turned into a 4-volume series that's getting produced by Melbourne University Press. And we've just released the call for papers for the 4th and final volume and the 4th conference, which will be in November. And there's printed copies of the call for papers out the front. So there's lots of, the 4th conference covers the period 61 to 66 and beyond, and there's lots of overlap between themes that we've been discussing here. There's really important events in that sort of military history space in that period, particularly Confrontasi, the introduction of conscription, and obviously Australia's first commitment to the Vietnam War. So if any of you have an original idea for a paper, I would strongly encourage you to put in a submission. So Australia's waterfront has often been at the centre of the nation's most serious industrial disputes, and this was certainly the case during the Menzies era of 1949 to 1966. When introducing the 1965 stevedoring industry bill, the 6th such bill drafted by the Menzies government as it exasperately tried to deal with a perpetual problem, Minister for Labour William McMahon cited statistics suggesting that despite making up less than 1% of Australia's workforce, waterside workers accounted for 21% of the total time lost by all workers in all industries over the preceding decade. But this was only the tip of the iceberg, because the stevedoring industry represented the crucial nexus point, or more often than not, bottleneck of the Australian economy. It was vital to the efficient expedition of our agricultural exports, which were then still the mainstay of our economy, and ever more so during the Korean War wool boom of the early 1950s. The waterfront brought in key imports that kept our domestic economy humming, whether they be necessary equipment for businesses or just consumer goods for households. And the waterfront's strategic significance in times of conflict simply cannot be overstated. War is a battle of logistics as much as it is a battle of courage, strategy, willpower, or anything else for that matter. In the early 1950s, the Cold War made a major World War III type conflict appear imminent. We've heard a lot about that over yesterday, that people really thought, and high up people really thought, that the Third World War was only a matter of time. And it was therefore of major concern to the Menzies government that the Waterside Workers' Federation, which held a virtual monopoly over the docks, was headed by an avowed and charismatic communist in Jim Healey. He was firmly entrenched in his position, having first been elected as General Secretary in 1937. In the event of a potential war with the USSR and its local allies in Asia, it remained to be seen whether the loyalties of Healey and the men who voted for him would lie with Australia or with the cause of international revolution. If the propaganda produced by the Federation's journal, The Maritime Worker, was anything to be believed, there loomed the very real possibility that it might side with the latter. From 1952, its editor was Rupert Lockwood, who would later appear before the Petrov Royal Commission that we've just heard about for authoring one of the documents that was handed over to the Soviets. Because a conflict of significant scale never did erupt, a definitive test of the loyalties of the WWF was never made. Instead, we are left with a long-running debate which essentially amounts to whether correlation equals causation. That is to say, whether the WWF's repeated militancy throughout this period was due to the fact that its communist leadership deliberately wanted to undermine Australia's national interest and therefore help the prospective enemy, or whether the strikes it spearheaded were promoted exclusively on the grounds of industrial concerns and were fairly typical of the Federation's long and turbulent history. The seminal text in this debate is Tom Sheridan's Australia's Own Cold War, The Waterfront under Menzies, published in 2006 after more than a decade of meticulous research. I think it's 15 years he actually spends on this book. Sheridan gives a really vigorous defense of Healy, describing him in glowing terms by saying, "In studying Australian industrial activity for 40 years, I have come across no more capable and attractive figure than Healy." A central aspect of Sheridan's argument is that the Waterside Workers' Federation was exactly what its name suggested, a highly federalised and decentralised organisation which was impossible for one man or leadership group to wield for nefarious purposes. Moreover, those branches of the WWF which exercised their autonomy by electing grouper anti-communist executives proved themselves to be no less disruptive than their communist counterparts over the Menzies period. Scarred by severe mistreatment during the Great Depression, waterside workers of all political stripes wanted to use the bargaining power provided by full employment and the consequent labour shortage to squeeze everything they could out of the recalcitrant ship owners. In this endeavour, they were remarkably successful, with McMahon's stevedoring industry bill speech citing an incredible 1,200% rise in the waterside workers' margins in the 30 years since 1935. In a relatively brief address such as this, I will not attempt to directly challenge Sheridan's conclusions, nor to summarise his detailed narrative of a saga which spawned 4 separate stevedoring acts and 2 additional draft bills, all of which aimed to bring the WWF into line so as to preserve the national interest, which the union, and admittedly definitely the ship owners as well, was seriously jeopardising. Though I will note briefly that even Sheridan admits, quote, "Belief in a red plot could perhaps be sustained if the coverage of foreign affairs in the maritime worker were taken as typical of Wharfie's views." He basically argues that rank and file WWF members are voting for communists because they feel that the communists are going to squeeze the most out of the ship owners, but this mainstream membership was generally ALP voting and wouldn't actually have gone on board for anything that was overtly pro-Soviet when push came to shove. And I think there's a lot of merit in that argument. I sort of feel in a difficult position because I'm not going to argue against 15 years of research with the amount of research I've put into this paper. But just because the rank and file membership weren't Soviets themselves or sort of Soviet leaning doesn't mean that in a crisis situation that leadership group couldn't have seriously jeopardised Australia, certainly in the sort of initial phases of an outbreak of conflict. Indeed, opponents of the communists always stressed that the party was small in terms of electoral support. It really didn't get that many votes at general elections, but that it had nevertheless infiltrated key positions like the leadership of the WWF and therefore this sort of control of critical infrastructure. Instead of rehashing Sheridan's narrative, I'm going to give something of a prehistory of Menzies' relationship with both the WWF and the Kremlin to reveal why he and his government were so prone to suspect an underlying motive of treason, or at least the prospect of treason should war break out. And my presentation sort of speaks to that issue that was raised yesterday about when did the Cold War begin. And I would argue that for Menzies, the Cold War is actually a natural outgrowth of the crisis of Western democracy in the 1930s, in the Great Depression, where everything seemed to be going wrong in Western democracies, and the fascist countries and the communist countries actually seemed to be doing surprisingly well. So there were major debates going on within Australia about whether democracy was ultimately viable, or whether efficiency required this sort of sacrifice of the individual to the national interest in a sort of fascist/communist manner. And there's a really fascinating series produced by ABC Radio in the mid-1930s that Menzies actually gives an address to, that's talking about this idea of can democracy survive. So it was a really mainstream sort of debate. But as far as his relationship with the WWF, it's worth just pointing out at the start that Menzies is not inherently opposed to trade unionism. His grandfather, John Sampson, was a Cornish miner who, after moving to Australia, was instrumental in taking the 600 members of the Creswick Miners' Union into the Australian Miners' Association, an act of union amalgamation for which he was consequently blackballed by the mine owners and never got a mining job again. Young Robert used to talk to his grandfather about political issues, and even though Robert admitted that he was far more conservative than Sampson, even as sort of a 13, 14-year-old, he was clearly sympathetic to Sampson's story and viewpoint. Menzies' relationship with the WWF actually started out on quite a positive note. As one of Australia's brightest young lawyers in the 1920s, he was happy to accept briefs from the Federation and for many other unions, and his claim to fame as a lawyer was victory in the engineers case, which was essentially a win for unionists as it brought their employers under the jurisdiction of the Commonwealth Arbitration Act. Working on the basis of the cab rank rule, Menzies likewise appeared for the ship owners on several occasions. In the latter capacity, he experienced firsthand the difficulty of getting the Federation to abide by the processes and decisions of the Arbitration Court. Menzies' attitude towards industrial relations throughout his career was seldom to seek radical reform in the manner of a John Howard, but instead to insist that the existing law was applied to the latter. On becoming Federal Attorney General in 1934, Menzies found himself at the centre of a major seamen's strike spanning 1935 to 6, which tangentially involved the WWF and was an early example of the Communist Party of Australia being at the centre of a major industrial dispute, and for its opponents deliberately instigating that dispute. Menzies also had his first taste of communism's international reach when he controversially tried to bar the entry of communist writer and activist Egon Kisch in 1934. The reason for the ban was that while Kisch was ostensibly only visiting Australia to preach against potential rearmament, Menzies had British intelligence reports linking Kisch with deliberate subversive activities. And Menzies by this time had acquainted himself with the central tenets of Marxist theory, and he insisted that by its very nature, communism connotes revolution rather than working within the prudent and successful confines of democratic government. But Menzies would ultimately be embarrassed by the whole Kisch affair because the High Court just basically threw out his attempt to ban, particularly his attempt to ban on the basis of the dictation test. There was this whole debate over whether Gaelic was indeed a European language. But it's also worth noting that Doc Abbott was then on the High Court, and he's one of the main sort of spearheads between throwing out the Kisch case. While under the ironic guise of anti-fascism, communists were thus trying to dissuade Australia from readying itself for war, they subsequently acted in a manner that might provoke a war in the famous Dalfram dispute, which is another great Wollongong icon, Reese. Taking place between November 1938 and January 1939, this was a protest in which Port Kembla WWF members, led by Healy's later deputy and fellow communist Ted Roach, refused to load scrap iron bound for Japan. Their argument was that this could be used to facilitate Japan's war with China, but at the same time, this was a clear example of the Federation's aims not being confined to industrial disputes in the manner which Sheridan tries to stress. Instead, they were directly concerned with the intimate workings of international relations, and specifically the interests of the Soviet Union, which was fighting a series of escalating border skirmishes with the Japanese in the mid to late 1930s. This forgotten war only ceased shortly after the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which I'll get to shortly, as Russia made peace in the East to allow it to pursue war in the West. Notably, this peace would last the vast majority of the Second World War, as even after joining the Allies, the Soviets refused to fight the Japanese until at the last second when it suited their plans of territorial aggrandizement. While Menzies' sympathies lay with nationalist China when it came to the Sino-Japanese conflict itself, and it is worth noting that later as Prime Minister, Menzies would formally establish Australia's diplomatic relationship with its government in 1941, he was resolute in opposing the waterside workers' stance. He believed that elected government must decide its own foreign policy, and that Australia imposing unilateral sanctions without the support of any other member of the League of Nations would do little to halt Japan's war machine, but it would do a great deal to unnecessarily antagonise its government. He would later explain that Australia also needed to buy time to catch up in the arms race, and that by maintaining the trade relationship, Australia was able to import from Japan a substantial quantity of lathes, grinding machines, and other technical equipment badly needed for Australia's munitions program. Although he exhibited considerable personal bravery in travelling to Wollongong to negotiate directly with the protesters, as this iconic photograph captures, Menzies' reputation took a very major hit from the Dalfram dispute, earning him the eternal epithet Pig-Iron Bob. But despite this, and the attacks of Country Party leader Earl Page, who thought Menzies was ill-suited to leadership on account of his lack of wartime service, Menzies was still able to succeed Prime Minister Joseph Lyons after he tragically passed away in office on Good Friday 1939. By this stage, the outbreak of war in Europe seemed almost inevitable, and indeed the stress resulting from this knowledge was one of the contributing factors to Lyons' premature death. However, the real harbinger of war would be the shock announcement of the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the respective foreign ministers of Russia and Germany, which was reported in Australia on 23 August 1939. When the note reached Menzies' desk, he could scarcely believe what he read. He described the news as impossible to reconcile with Herr Hitler's repeated claim to be Europe's bulwark against Russian communism, and likewise completely contradictory of the fact that the Nazi alliance with Japan was called the Anti-Comintern Pact. In the weeks to come, the Soviets would assist in the Nazis' invasion of Poland, which was carved up between the two totalitarian powers under the pretext that the USSR was stepping in to protect ethnic Russians in Poland's erstwhile Eastern Territory, a sort of excuse that's been used many, many times before and since. Additionally, the USSR would use the cover of the conflict to invade Finland. For these reasons, during the early part of the war, which is precisely the time that Menzies is Prime Minister, the Soviet Union was functioning as a de facto Axis power. And Menzies openly lamented the Soviet duplicity, noting that, quote, only a few months ago, Russia was discussing ways and means of protecting Baltic states, including Finland, against German aggression. Today, she has invaded Finland herself. One more small European power is to be crushed. The march of force goes on, but the war has yet to begin. In contrast to Menzies' sympathy for the Finns, the Communist Party of Australia directly sought to propagate the Soviet position. Australian communists argued that it was the aristocratic leadership of Britain and France who had deliberately tried to set Hitler and Stalin upon a collision course, but instead the superior Soviet leadership had frustrated the insidious plans of the provokers of war and secured peace between the two largest powers in Europe. The war between the Nazis and the democratic West was described as being a struggle between two groups of imperialists for the repartition of the world. Hence, Australia's war effort had no moral superiority to that of its enemy and should be actively undermined. As for Finland, on 12 December 1939, the Sydney Trades Hall hosted a rally supporting the invasion, where the communists' own newspaper, the Tribune, reported wave after wave of applause interrupted the speech of Lance Sharkey, national chairman of the party. This is a communist rally in 1940 in Melbourne. In the period after Poland's capitulation, the Communist Party of Australia were one of the central advocates of the so-called phony war. The idea that Australia did not need to mobilise, as the British had merely been saving face when they declared war over Poland, and now that the territory was conquered, the conflict would peter out. The widespread acceptance of such an idea was a major obstacle to the Menzies government, as it was trying to galvanise the nation so that it would be willing to make the necessary sacrifices for the task ahead. Instead, there was major opposition to even the most minor inconvenience, such as early attempts to limit fuel consumption. Once the concept of the phony war itself proved to be a mirage, the communists instead turned their attention to encouraging strikes in a bid to undermine the so-called imperialists. Paul Hasluck's Official History, The Government and the People, Volume 1, argues that during the war, industrial stoppages were regarded by the communists as being of prime importance as a political weapon rather than as an immediate objective in themselves. There are also serious allegations that the communists were trying to infiltrate our military. In January 1940, a memorandum was submitted to the War Cabinet which warned that the well-known method of communists was to plant cells in units, one to spread propaganda and to lead agitation, and another to collect information and to learn as much as possible of military technique, especially the handling of arms. It was also known that the party had a special section whose principal task was to carry out this secret work in the armed forces, and that recently branches had been instructed that the party's unknown members must join the militia, although the party's public fight against conscription was to continue. One definite instance at Ingleburn was quoted of a proposal that party organisers should work on the discontent of troops over alleged profiteering in canteens and organise them for mass demonstrations against the federal government. The Naval Board reported its own, quote, clear indications that communist agitation and activities are growing amongst naval personnel, and all three services pressed the government to use security regulations to declare the Communist Party an illegal organisation. The Cabinet initially resisted these proposals on civil liberty grounds, but further investigations led to a ban finally being imposed on 15 June 1940. Such a ban did not stop the communists from putting up their own independent candidates at the 1940 election, nor continuing with their disruptive propaganda, albeit at a more limited scale, because obviously ink was rationed. It was very difficult to sort of clandestine print a newspaper mid-World War II. Indeed, when Hitler finally did invade Russia in Operation Barbarossa, Hasluck reports that the Australian communists were so used to parroting Soviet talking points that they were initially confused as to how to react to the whole situation. Far from embracing Mother Russia's new allies, they continued to insist that the changed circumstances did not alter, quote, the class character of the ruling monopolists in our own country or any other. Sheridan cites the fact that the industrial disputes on the waterfront continued even after Russia joined the Allies as evidence that the WWF was not a Soviet puppet under Healy, which is at best a backhanded compliment suggesting that the waterside workers were consistent in their disregard for the broader national interests in the midst of war. With Labor now in government, Menzies drew a similar conclusion in the Manifesto of the National Service Group, which he released in April 1943 to announce that he was forming what was essentially a splinter group within the United Australia Party to push for the elimination of any territorial limits on where conscripts could be deployed. This is obviously the big political debate in 1943. Kirk had to go to great lengths to get through the Labor caucus, even a very minor sort of extension of where our conscripts could be sent. Weaving the forgotten people ideology with a denunciation of the WWF, point 7 of Menzies' manifesto read, "We must abandon our suicidal policy of wiping out the middle class of people. Why should they who have no unions, who draw fixed or modest incomes, who get no cost of living adjustments, whose taxes are doubled and redoubled, who have few capital resources such as the rich have, and no drilled, disciplined political party to serve their ends, be required at a time like this to dig into their pockets in order that the waterside workers should be paid amazing wages. So the main point of my argument is that for Menzies, concern about the strategic threat posed by communists on the waterfront was not the product of some Cold War hysteria. It was the product of learned experience during his first stint as Prime Minister and afterwards. When Russian victories on the Eastern Front led to people in Australia beginning to lionise the Red Army, Menzies was very keen to ensure that the public did not forget the early treachery of Australia's communists, nor mistake ordinary Russians defending their homeland as something inspired by a love of Stalin's supposed utopia. In one of his Forgotten People radio addresses, delivered in that same month of April 1943, Menzies implored his listeners to recognise a class of men whose historic place in Australia's war effort is that they were against the war when it was merely the British people against a ruthless and powerful enemy, but became its supporters when Russia was attacked by Germany. When your sons were wounded or dying in Libya or Greece, these men were actively opposing production on the home front. They made no demand for a second European front when Britain was fighting the bitter battle of 1940 for our safety and the freedom of the world. They were too busy making strikes their business. Given this context, and particularly that belief in the imminent nature of a World War III type scenario, it's arguably not that surprising that on coming to power in 1949, Menzies pursued the Communist Party Dissolution Act, one of the main targets of which was Healey and the WWF, as Healey and all other communists would have been barred from union leadership positions under the legislation. After all, communists had been so disruptive during a war to which the USSR was not originally an official party. How much more disruptive were communists likely to be when the workers' paradise was itself the enemy? What is arguably perhaps more surprising is that Menzies initially opposed conservative bans for the reimposition of the wartime ban. So the ban itself wasn't even considered that novel because it had been imposed during the war. So it was a reimposition of a ban rather than something that is just a completely new idea that's entirely concocted during the Cold War. He actually split with the Country Party over the issue at the 1946 elections. So Arthur Fadden and the Country Party are supporting this reimposition of a ban from the very start of the Cold War, while the Liberals, who do have a certain amount of respect for civil liberties, do sort of have to contemplate it. It's not a sort of gut reaction to go hardcore conservative straight away. It is worth noting that Healey was even, as has been well documented by biographer Alan Martin, as well as Human Rights Commissioner Lorraine Finlay in her recent chapter for the Menzies Watershed, which is the second volume in our series, it was changing international and domestic circumstances which prompted Menzies' change of heart. These included the communist coup in Czechoslovakia in February 1948, the blockade of West Berlin, the detonation of the first Soviet nuclear weapon, and of course, communist victory in the Chinese Civil War, as well as large-scale railway and coal strikes within Australia. It is worth noting that Healey was even jailed for how vigorously the WWF supported the 1949 coal strike, which caused such a major disruption that even the Chifley government famously felt compelled to send in the army to break the strike. Simply put, these were not ordinary times, particularly when it came to industrial disruption, and it was not unreasonable for observers to assume that communist-led unions were at least partly inspired by communism when it came to their actions. Indeed, it would have been somewhat bizarre were they to assume that such leadership figures were not informed at all by an ideology to which they openly professed. Nevertheless, Menzies' main concern over Australian communism remained strategic and defensive. It was the external threat posed by a fifth column in times of conflict. He did not see the party as a direct political threat, considering its small electoral support, nor did he think it strong enough to attempt a peacetime coup. This is largely confirmed by the fact that the Communist Party Dissolution Act relied explicitly on the defence power outlined in Section 51 of the Constitution, Menzies was preempting an imminent war, and even this quite famous piece of propaganda from the subsequent referendum campaign makes it clear that, again, it's the external threat that you're trying to combat by banning communism within Australia. However, Menzies' attempt to preempt the outbreak of war in his Communist Party Dissolution Act was deemed unconstitutional by the High Court after Doc Evatt accepted a brief from the WWF. The judge's reasoning was essentially that the Cold War did not constitute an actual war, and therefore the defence power could not be used. However, as Justice Edelman points out in the Young Menzies, recent High Court judgments have broadened the application of the defence power, such that Michael Kirby has argued that it appeared likely, had the Dissolution Act of 1950 been challenged today, its constitutional validity would have been upheld. This is because, in the modern era of terrorism, judges have become far more open to the idea that matters of national defence cannot be confined to openly declared wars between nation states. But the 1950s were obviously not the 2000s. Instead, in light of the High Court decision and subsequent narrow referendum defeat, the Menzies government was left to use more moderate legislative devices in an attempt to bring the WWF to heel. You can read Sheridan for an account of how that occurred, but I hope I've provided some insight into why that occurred. Thanks.
We have just a couple of minutes for questions, so questions.
Zachary, that was very interesting. In anticipation of this presentation this morning, I was prompted to revisit a book I've got at home, Australia's Secret War by Hal Colbach. And it's mainly about the Second World War and how the waterside workers prevented stuff being offloaded or loaded onto ships. And the coal strikes, there were instances of aircraft engines being taken off ships and sort of dropped onto the wharf and virtually destroyed. Ships being, aeroplanes being lifted off ships while they were still shackled to the deck, and it just wrecked the aeroplane. And I was just wondering, was Menzies in the war cabinet during World War II, and did he play a part in sort of trying to stop this sort of activity?
Yeah, so he stays in the, even after he loses his prime ministership, he was the one who set up the war cabinet in the first instance, because basically the war cabinet, including both the opposition and the government, was his second best option after failing to secure a national government. What he really wanted was a national government like you had in Britain. And then he does stay in the war cabinet until 1944. So he is privy to all these sort of debates. And again, he's very conscious of the fact that, things with the Russians haven't changed so much. We shouldn't forget that they were sort of actively our enemy, and even when they become an ally, they're only an ally to the extent that it suits them, because they refuse to declare war on the Japanese. But he ultimately leaves the war cabinet because his argument is that the current government is pursuing partisan legislation, and particularly with the Powers referendum in 1944, and that therefore the opposition needs the freedom to actually be an opposition.
I apologise for coming a little late and missing the first part of your address, but my recollection of the history I've read is that there was no Commonwealth police in those days. Is that right?
I think you're correct, but yeah.
Now, if that be so, I'm wondering how much emphasis was placed on the state police special branches in ascertaining intelligence on what was going on. How was put another way, how was Menzies best informed, aside from his personal observations as a pretty good lawyer? What was his source of intelligence about all of this?
Well, certainly you had the submissions in the war cabinet about what was going on in the army, and it is this sort of correlation versus causation debate about, you had the waterside workers deliberately, constantly engaging in strikes, and they happened to be led by a communist. So a lot of the dots were sort of connected rather than necessarily being deliberate intelligence.
Can I just add to that? There was a Commonwealth Police Force at that point, and there was something called the Commonwealth Investigation Branch, which was part of the Attorney General's Department, and they performed some of the very early security intelligence activities for the federal government prior to the creation of what was then the Commonwealth Investigation Service.
Oh, good.
So there was a federal intelligence function and an agency performing that in some way before the Second World War.
Any more questions? Okay, morning tea is approaching. Let me say there was a most interesting and thorough presentation. Please join me in thanking Zachary Gorman.